Genesis 22. God tells Abraham to sacrifice your son, your only son, whom you love. Everyone assumes this was Isaac. But there's a chronological problem they can't explain. And it's hidden in circumcision practices. The binding story is a covenant moment. Covenants require conscious consent. The son had to be old enough to understand, old enough to choose, old enough to remember. In Jewish tradition, circumcision happens at 8 days old. The baby has no awareness, no memory, no choice. In Islamic tradition, circumcision happens at the age of awareness, between 7 and 13 years old. The child remembers. The child participates consciously. Which tradition preserves what the binding story actually required? And what does that tell us about which son was really on the altar? The binding, called the Akedah in Jewish tradition, is one of the most profound stories in Scripture. God commands Abraham to take his beloved son to Mount Moriah and offer him as a sacrifice. Abraham obeys. The son submits. At the last moment, God provides a ram and spares the son. This becomes the ultimate test of faith, the moment that defines Abraham's covenant with God. But here's what most people miss. This isn't just about Abraham's faith. It's about the son's faith too. This is a covenant moment, a mutual agreement between Abraham, his son, and God. And covenants don't work with unconscious participants. Let's be clear about what a covenant is. It's not a decree imposed on someone unconscious. It's not a unilateral command. A covenant is a mutual agreement between parties who both understand what they're entering into. When God makes a covenant with Abraham at the binding, both Abraham and his son must consciously participate. Abraham must choose to obey. The son must choose to submit. That's what makes this the ultimate test of faith. Both must willingly surrender their will to God's command. This is why the binding story is so powerful. It's not about an unconscious infant being placed on an altar who doesn't know what's happening. It's about a father and son, both aware, both understanding the stakes, both choosing God over their own lives, both making a conscious covenant. For this to work theologically, the son must be old enough to understand what's happening, old enough to be afraid, yet choose trust anyway. Old enough to walk up the mountain knowingly. Old enough to lie down on that altar by choice. Old enough to remember this moment for the rest of his life. Covenant requires consciousness. Consciousness requires age. Age reveals which son. Now let's look at the timeline, because this is where the traditional narrative falls apart. Genesis tells us, Ishmael was born when Abraham was 86 years old. Isaac was born when Abraham was 100 years old. That's a simple fact recorded in Scripture. Ishmael was Abraham's only son for 14 years. 14 years. Now, the binding story uses very specific language. Take your son, your only son, whom you love. Your only son. When did Abraham have an only son? From Ishmael's birth until Isaac's birth. For 14 years, Ishmael was the only son. The phrase fits perfectly, but traditional interpretation insists this was Isaac. So let's examine that claim. Various rabbinic sources place Isaac's age at the binding anywhere from 3 to 37 years old. They can't even agree. Let's be generous and say Isaac was 13 years old, the minimum age for covenant participation in Jewish tradition. If Isaac was 13, Ishmael was 27 years old. Both sons are around. Both are conscious. Both could participate in a covenant. So why does God say, your only son? The traditional answer tries to explain this away. It means the only son of Sarah, or the only son of the promise. But that's adding words that aren't there. The text simply says, your only son, full stop. And Abraham didn't have an only son at that point if both Isaac and Ishmael were alive and conscious. But what if the binding happened when Ishmael was the actual only son? Let's say Ishmael was 13 years old enough to understand covenant, old enough to consciously participate, old enough to remember. If Ishmael was 13, Isaac either wasn't born yet or was an infant, too young to be conscious, too young to consent to covenant, too young to be described as Abraham's son in the covenantal sense. Now your only son makes perfect sense. Abraham has one son old enough for covenant participation, one son who can understand what's being asked, one son who can consciously choose to submit, one son who will remember this moment, Ishmael. The phrase isn't forced or explained away. It's literally accurate. Abraham's only son capable of entering into covenant at that time. And here's the devastating detail. The binding story establishes circumcision as the covenant sign. Genesis 17 introduces circumcision, and the binding in Genesis 22 confirms it as the mark of this ultimate covenant between Abraham, his son, and God. Now, if the son in the binding was old enough to consciously covenant, old enough to understand and remember, what does that tell us about the age for circumcision as a covenant marker? And this is where circumcision traditions expose which narrative is true. In Jewish tradition, circumcision happens at 8 days old. It's called the bris, or Brit Milah. The baby is 8 days old. He has no awareness of what's happening. He won't remember this moment. He can't consent to anything. He's an unconscious participant. Parents make the decision entirely. Think about that. If the binding story, the moment Abraham and his son entered into covenant with God, established circumcision as the covenant sign, why would that covenant be marked on unconscious infants? Covenant requires understanding. Covenant requires choice. Covenant requires memory of the commitment made. An 8-day-old baby has none of these things. Now let's look at Islamic tradition. In Islamic tradition, circumcision happens at what's called the age of awareness, the age of discernment. This is typically between 7 and 13 years old, though it can vary. The child is old enough to understand the religious significance, old enough to remember the event for the rest of his life, old enough to consciously participate in the Abrahamic covenant. The child knows what's happening. The child remembers. The child participates in entering the covenant with awareness and understanding, just like the son in the binding story would have. This isn't coincidence. Islamic practice preserves what the binding story actually required: conscious participation in covenant at the age of understanding and memory. Which tradition makes sense if the binding established circumcision as the covenant marker? Does it make sense to mark the covenant on unconscious babies who will never remember entering it? Or does it make sense to mark the covenant on children at the age when they can consciously participate? The same age the son in the binding had to be? Here's the theological problem with the traditional narrative. You cannot have a covenant with someone who can't understand it. God doesn't make binding agreements with unconscious parties. That's not how covenant works. Abraham knew what he was doing. He was conscious, aware, choosing. The son had to be equally conscious, aware, and choosing. That's what makes it a covenant, rather than a command imposed on an unwilling or unknowing participant. If Isaac was the son and Jewish practice circumcises at 8 days, then either 1. The binding happened when Isaac was 8 days old, which means an infant who couldn't climb a mountain, couldn't understand what was happening, and couldn't consciously submit. That makes the story meaningless as a test of faith for the son. Or 2. The binding happened when Isaac was older, conscious, and able to participate. But then Jewish tradition disconnected circumcision from the binding's requirement for conscious participation, making circumcision a parental ritual instead of the child's covenant moment. Why would they do that unless they were covering up a transfer? But if Ishmael was the son, everything makes sense. He was 13 plus years old enough to understand, choose, and remember. And Islamic practice preserves this by circumcising at the age of awareness, maintaining the connection between the binding story and conscious covenant participation. The theology demands consciousness. The chronology provides it through Ismael. The Islamic practice preserves it. This is the same pattern we've documented throughout the series. The scribes transferred Ishmael's honors to Isaac, but they couldn't perfectly cover their tracks. They transferred the binding story to Isaac, but they couldn't fix the chronology. Your only son still doesn't work when both sons are alive and conscious. They transferred the circumcision covenant, But they had to change the age to infancy because they couldn't admit the original son was a conscious teenager. So they created a practice that contradicts the covenant theology of the story itself. They transferred the 12-son blessing, but they couldn't erase the parallel structure that proves both sons received the same divine pattern. They transferred Ismael's obedience, but the reconciliation at Abraham's burial still shows his peaceful character, contradicting the wild donkey slander. Every time they transferred something from Ismael to Isaac, they left evidence. The timeline doesn't quite work. The phrases don't quite fit. The practices don't quite match the theology. And Islamic tradition preserved what Jewish tradition had to change. This is what happens when you rewrite history. You can change the narrative, but you can't change the chronology. You can transfer the story, but you can't transfer the timeline. The mathematics of years don't lie. Ishmael was the only son for 14 years. That's when the binding happened. And circumcision practices prove which tradition remembers the truth. If Ishmael was the son in the binding story, this was his moment of ultimate obedience. This was the covenant moment that defined his relationship with God. A teenage boy, understanding fully what was being asked, climbing the mountain with his father, lying down on the altar voluntarily, trusting God completely, even with his life, choosing submission over survival. This is faith tested at the highest level and proven genuine. This was conscious, remembered, chosen obedience. Not an infant who couldn't comprehend. Not a ritual performed on someone unconscious. But a teenager who said yes to God with full awareness of what that meant. The scribes couldn't let Ismael have this honor. They couldn't admit that the son they called wild demonstrated the ultimate obedience. They couldn't acknowledge that Ishmael passed the greatest test of faith in Scripture. So they transferred it to Isaac. But they couldn't make the chronology work. They couldn't make your only son fit. And they had to change the circumcision age to hide that covenant requires consciousness. The timeline proves it. The theology demands it. The practices reveal it. Ishmael was the son, Abraham took up that mountain. And Islamic tradition preserved the truth through circumcision at the age of awareness, just as the binding required. Let's review the evidence. Your only son. Ismael was Abraham's only son for 14 years. The phrase fits perfectly. With Isaac conscious, it doesn't fit at all. Covenant theology requires conscious consent, understanding, and memory. Islamic circumcision at age of awareness preserves this. Jewish circumcision at 8 days contradicts it. The chronology. If Isaac was old enough to consciously participate, Ishmael was in his 20s or 30s. Both sons are present. Only son, impossible. But if Ishmael was 13 to 16, Isaac was infant, or not yet born. Only son is literally true. The cultural practices, Islamic tradition maintains circumcision at the age the binding required. Jewish tradition changed it to infancy, disconnecting practice from the story's theology. The pattern, every transfer from Ismael to Isaac leaves evidence of imperfect erasure. This is no different. The evidence converges on one conclusion. Ishmael was the son. The timeline proves it. The covenant theology demands it. The practices reveal which tradition preserved the truth. Covenants require consent. The binding was a covenant. The son had to be conscious. Ismael was old enough. Isaac was not. Your only son fits Ismael's timeline perfectly. It doesn't fit Isaac's timeline at all. Circumcision at the age of awareness preserves what the binding required. Circumcision at 8 days old contradicts it. The chronology proves it. The theology demands it. The practices reveal it. This wasn't just any story they transferred. This was the ultimate test of faith. The defining covenant moment. The story that shows Abraham's complete submission to God. And the son in that story, the one who climbed the mountain consciously, who submitted willingly, who remembered that moment forever, was Ishmael. Next, Scripture itself admits the scribes lied. Jeremiah 8:8. The confession that validates everything we've uncovered.